My name is John Sweeney. I'm the editor of Living City magazine, published by Focolare Media. And we welcomed, for the first time, all of our subscribers to join us if they would like to meet the author of a dissertation that deals with Focolare. All of you hopefully have read the interview, which was titled "Drawn to Disunity Like a Magnet" in the current issue of Living City. Let me just introduce him very briefly. He's Father Patrick Gilger, a member of the Society of Jesus. He's an assistant professor of sociology at Loyola University, Chicago. And before arriving there, he wrote his dissertation about three ecclesial movements originating in Italy: Communion and Liberation, Sant'Egidio, and Focolare. He is currently at work transforming that work into a book tentatively titled The Subject of Public Religion. He shares his insights into the gifts that the charism of unity has to offer to today's world. And he was interviewed by Suzanne Jansen in the current issue of the magazine. And we wanted to sort of take the interview off the page and to introduce him to you live. And so we're delighted that you could join us.
Thank you, John. Yeah, this is a pleasure to be with you all in this new way. I'm happy to be kind of the inaugural venture forth, or the guinea pig, maybe we should say, for this new way of engaging with Living City Media. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's nice. It's good that you're willing to be our guinea pig. But I wanted to sort of get us into a conversation about unity. But as I was sort of preparing for this afternoon, I will admit it was awfully difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, what a time it is in the world, at this moment to talk about unity. First, we had, Russia and Ukraine at war. We have civil wars in Afghanistan, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Syria. And then for the last 3 days, we've had war in Israel and Palestine. I have a lot of Jewish friends. I have friends who have been directly affected. I have Muslim friends who are angry about, my concern for my Jewish friends. I mean, it is just such a difficult time in the present moment. And so to talk about unity almost starts to feel pie in the sky or something. But I wanted to sort of just put that out there and say, how do we talk about unity at times like this?
Yeah, I'm grateful that you begin in that way, John, because it's been on my mind as well. Just last night, I was sitting around one of the Jesuit rec rooms. I was visiting some friends down at Xavier University in Cincinnati. I'm in Chicago usually. And we're sitting down there, just enjoying time together before we went to eat. And then we turned on, Al Jazeera, and then BBC Europe, BBC England, and to try to see what was happening here. And every image was like harder to bear. All of the comments seemed to be so many words that we don't want to hear, don't want to listen to, so many images that we want to withdraw from or push away from. And I think that kind of thing is very normal. I certainly see that happening in myself these days, where I kind of have to gear up to go read the newspaper in the morning, as opposed to this being a distracting thing or something, a calm way to begin. But I wish there was an easy answer as to how to begin this stuff. I mean, I think that we have to take seriously at what level we are interested ourselves in responding. These could be all kinds of little things. Are we praying for peace, as Pope Francis has asked us to in a number of ways? Or are we talking with people who are, may agree with us or may disagree with us? Are we reading? And then maybe there are some things that we're being called to do. Are we being called to be those people who stand on the street corner, as a witness to peace, and to try to do something like this, or to reach out to our friends at a local synagogue or at a mosque and see if something is happening there? Or maybe there are a few of us who are being called to something more radical, where we're being invited to see if we can go, or to work in some more radical way with the issues that are pressing for us here. I know in Chicago, I'm sure all over the country, there's been a number of busloads of refugees being shipped to different place after place after place. So that can be another way to respond to these crises of disunity that we're facing in our times.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question that I hope doesn't put you on the spot, because you and I did not talk beforehand about what I was going to ask you. And if we had, I wouldn't have thought to ask you this question before today anyway. But and I'm not asking as a sociologist. I want to ask you as a theologian. Where is the Holy Spirit in times of war and conflict? I mean, how do we discern, ask for, understand the presence of the Holy Spirit in these particularly difficult moments?
Yeah. So the criteria of the question, really, for me as a Jesuit, right, involves turning back to some of what I've been taught over many years about discernment. So the question that we might ask first is, what does it feel like to be close to the Holy Spirit? And what are the sensations that we have in our bodies and in our minds when that kind of pattern is operative? So I think the first thing that we may notice, or what St. Ignatius would say, is that he differentiates between consolation and desolation. Desolation as the movement. These are both movements. They're not even events. They're patterns in our lives that we can see happening. And the movement away from God, often into isolation, despair, resistance, depression, is what he calls desolation. And that distances us from persons and locks us down, often ideologizes, these kinds of things. And the movement of consolation is the contrast to this. So, these are movements that increase faith, hope, and love in us, and that often can lead to tears, whether of joy or of sorrow. And I say sorrow at the end there intentionally, because I think that's one of the things that we have to pay close attention to in this way of talking about sensing what the Holy Spirit can do, because it can be a little easy for us to think that the Holy Spirit only makes us feel good, and that is not the case. So I think what we could see then is that if the evaluation becomes a movement that happens inside of us that draws us closer to another or to a community in faith or in hope or in love, even if that drawing nearer is a cause for deeper suffering, that can be a clear sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit. An example to supplement this theory, maybe I should have started with the example and gone to the theory afterwards, but you've got a social theorist here in front of you, John, so I apologize. But the example would be something like this. All of us have seen these pictures these days. I hope we've all seen, of family members kneeling near the recently dug graves of their relatives, whether those graves are in Israel or in Gaza. And the sorrow and pain that is on the faces and in the bodies of those people curled up next to the flowers and sometimes a religious symbol that's there. That pain, if we're invited to draw closer to that itself, drawing closer is an act of hope, and that drawing closer can be an act of love, even though it's a response to pain. And then being close to those who are suffering can also be painful at times. So that's kind of what I would say, is that where the Holy Spirit is practically in our own action can be discerned in those kinds of ways. The other thing, just to say very quickly, is that the Holy Spirit is clearly involved in lament, but also in cries for justice. And that includes building structures for peace in the present tense, interrupting acts of violence.
Well, I'm really glad I asked you that question now. And I'm glad that you talked about times of suffering, because you're anticipating what I think is going to be a question I ask you a couple down the line about conflict. But before we get there, I don't want to move through things too fast. I mean, as I mentioned sort of at the top, you wrote a dissertation on this topic, and you spoke to a large gathering of Focolare last year on this topic. And you say in the interview in the current issue of Living City a lot about the topic that we're discussing. But please, if you don't mind, since you've already done that there's been a few iterations of this, could you do it one more time? Could you briefly describe for us, tell our readers and those who have joined us on this conversation, what do Focolare have to offer the world that is in such need of unity? What have you found? Because you've done a lot of research.
Yeah. So just maybe a brief story about how I got into this, and then maybe that can lead into answering more directly your question. You know, I never really planned to be a scholar. I was in Jesuit formation for 11 or 12 years, and then had been ordained about a decade ago and sent back to my own alma mater at Creighton University, and to be the pastor of the parish on campus. And it was a great job for me, something I would have felt happy doing for a long time. But we are a hierarchical order, the Society of Jesus, and so my boss showed up and said, "We want you to go do a PhD." And I was like, "Well, I guess that's that." Now I got to decide what I was going to pursue. And at the time, I had been in school already for a long time. We do a lot of graduate education. And one of the things that was a very pressing concern for me was to try to answer philosophically and sociologically how people become or remain religious persons in our secular age. And so I was interested in that kind of question in a more philosophical than sociological sense initially. So I applied to all these programs. And I tell my colleagues here in the sociology department at Loyola Chicago that, I'm almost not a sociologist at all. I'm a social theoretician. That's true. But I'm like the resident philosopher in the sociology department. And they're like, no, that's good. We need someone to teach theory. So that's good. I'm happy to do it for them. But I went to a place called the New School in New York City because it was a place where I could study social theory in the classical tradition and answer these questions. But as the Lord was operative in my mind as well as in my heart over those years of study, it became clear that first question, how do you become or remain a religious person in our secular times, was only part of the question that it seemed like the Lord wanted me to ask. Maybe it was the first part, right? How do you become this kind of person? But the second part was, and what can this kind of person do? Like, so what? Like that was that kind of a question. And it just kept like digging at me. And I read a lot and thought a lot. And then when it came time for me to, move towards the last stage of my doctoral research, I thought, well, I have to try to find places where people are doing something like this or responding to this. And I wasn't even sure I was going to do Catholic groups. And I thought maybe I'll do the Catholic Worker. I know them very well in New York City and other places. And then I just kind of bumped into these three communities of Italians, right? The Focolare, Sant'Egidio, and Community Liberation. And I thought, wow, this is so strange. And they're so different. All three of these, more or less post-Vatican II movements of lay people struggling to find a way in a church that has recently kind of, acclimated itself to the political structures of modernity, basically accepted a division of church and state. And I was like, well, I don't know, where are these people? And then I started poking around. I was like, wait a minute, they're here. They're all here around New York. And so I felt very providential. And so I got to go meet a bunch of people. I went up to Luminosa and then went to the different communities of Focolarina and Focolarina at, down in Manhattan and other places around there. I did the same thing for the other movements and got interested in this. And the thing that happened as I spent about a year and a half or more, maybe 2 years, immersed in the life of these movements, sometimes a month at a time, sometimes 3 months at a time, where I would go to a bunch of meetings and meet people and talk and just show up to everything, was great. And I got to feel the first thing I noticed was that even though I'm a Catholic and a Jesuit and a priest, that there were things going on here, ways people talked, things you did, that I just didn't understand. And I was like, what is happening? How could this be that I don't get this? I don't understand this. And that kind of lack of understanding became for me the beginning of asking a better question about what is happening in the movements, asking that first question, how do you become this kind of person, in a more rigorous way? There's a great line from the poet E.E. Cummings that I stumbled along upon the way, and I use it as the epigraph for my dissertation. It just says, always the more beautiful answer who asks the more beautiful question. And I took that as kind of the mantra that I wanted to have as I explored what was happening in these movements. And there were lots of things that I admired and understood relatively quickly about the Focolare. I was like, okay, I kind of get this, or I was amazed at, but weren't necessarily confusing. That Chiara and coincidentally her 12 female friends found the movement. Okay, so it's amazing. It's not, but I wasn't necessarily, didn't seem like a puzzle, But the thing that occurred to me as a puzzle was how people in the movement spoke about the meaning of Jesus forsaken, or embracing Jesus forsaken, and diving into that and how people understand this in their daily life, and how they do their best to embrace these moments of forsakenness in the world around us, what forsakenness means and feels like for different members of the movement. That became fascinating to me. And then I read and thought and a bunch, and read everything I could about the movement. I think I've read virtually every book that New City Press has published on the movement, and I read a million pieces of Chiara's writing and watched a ton of her videos. I wrote to the Chiara Lubick archives many times and said, "Hey, can I have this one? Can I have this one?" And in the midst of that, I found these incredible talks that she would give, often to Focolare, often in Italy, and these would be translated in different ways. And so I would watch her explain to other experts of the movement what it really meant to embrace Jesus forsaken. And it was doing that and then asking people about it and talking about it that started to open up for me this experience of, okay, I can start finally to see why this very strange thing of embracing moments of forsakenness in one's own life, or being willing to come closer to it in the lives of others, why that is such a powerful and confusing thing for me. And it put both a spiritual challenge on me and an intellectual challenge to try to understand those two things. I think those are very tied together, in fact.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, which brings me to that question I said that I wanted to ask, which is about conflict. You say in our interview, and I'm sure you say in the dissertation too, but I'll be honest, I haven't read the dissertation.
I'll remedy that in the future, John.
you say in our interview that conflict is not a problem. It's a means for unity. And I know that Chiara Lubick taught something similar and modeled something similar, because I've heard some stories about it. But I wanted you to talk about that how is conflict not a problem, and how is it a means for unity?
Yeah, so let me try to answer that first in the practical way, and then to say something a little bit theoretical about it. The practical is this. I think there is no possibility of realizing the kind of unity that Chiara actually called for without going through conflict. Now, we could take that in two ways, right? Some people would say, okay, yeah, I actually see that very well. We need to have some tension about our initial disagreements, and then we can move through them into a place of unity. Okay. But other people might be like, but what if we already, agree? Or what if we already see some of this? But I think even in those moments, we can see that tension, in fact, arises all the time in human life. Now, I'm not married, but I do a lot of marriage preparation with couples and a bunch of weddings. I have a wedding coming up in 2 weeks, which will be fantastic. And just getting to listen and spend time with these couples as they're getting ready to experience the sacrament, or with, many friends of mine who've been married for many years. It's always striking to me how sometimes the things that are most tender, that can cause conflict in the relationship, are sometimes the last things that are getting spoken about, even amongst these people who are absolutely intimate with one another. And there can be this great hesitation amongst people who love one another implicitly to bring up this thing that feels very vulnerable. And then we may feel comfortable bringing it up with our sister or our mother or our brother or something like this, or our best friend. But it's right in those moments of conflict, in fact, and walking into them with one another, that unity can be realized. So that's kind of the practice of it. Let me say a little bit theologically and then maybe theoretically. theologically, I've been reading this book lately by a Jesuit, Michael Buckley, passed away a few years ago. Um, and it's a series of retreat talks that he gave on the questions of Jesus. And in the midst of one of these, he's asked a question about the question about sin comes up, which could be fit right into this, right? Sin is, he says, sin is nothing other than the willed absence of God in our lives, creating a space where from which we exclude God. And then from that recognition, he moves really beautifully into something that I think we're trying to talk about here with regard to conflict. He says, if it is the case that sin is the willed absence of God in our lives, what reconciliation is, or going to confession, receiving the sacrament there, is allowing God to flood with his presence a place that we have made his absence. It is the tension and the conflict and walking into it that allows that kind of thing to happen. The last thing briefly about the theory stuff is that so often in our lives, like part of what it means to live in our very different and divided and fragile and pluralized times is that the way we encounter one another first, like the human apparatus with which we encounter one another first, is not the body or the heart or even the eyes. It's often just the mind, you know. And when we do that and encounter one another first in our ideas, then the kind of what we anticipate conflict being is a difference of ideas. And that's not particularly interesting with regard to what, conflict might have meant for Chiara. I think, yeah, reconciling a difference in ideas can be very important. But much more important than that is the willingness to remain in a place of tension long enough for another person who is resisting us to begin to open, or ourselves to begin to open in the midst of that would be resistance.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm going to ask you one more question and then I'm going to open it up, but I really want to ask you this one too. So I know that you pay close attention to secularity. I know you are, a devotee of Charles Taylor.
I am, yeah.
And that's wonderful. But where my mind has turned in recent years, months, I suppose, and a couple of years, is sort of past secularity to a handicap that's unknown previously to our species, this handicap of attention span. And I know people in different industries who are seriously worried about this, that they won't be able to get young people growing up today, 10, 20 years from now, the people who make football games or baseball games won't be able to have an audience of people who are willing to spend 2 hours, even though we've shortened the game to 2 hours. They aren't willing to sit for 2 hours. People who make movies are worried because, people who are growing up now are learning, and we are learning. We as adults our brains are recalibrating so that we can't sit still and pay attention to something for 2 hours. So, and then, not to mention books. I mean, buying books and actually reading books, those of us who are doing that kind of work for a living, why bother? So has it ever been more difficult to listen? I mean, has it ever been more difficult to speak and be heard? Has it ever been more difficult to change someone's mind, or to have your mind to be able to change because we have this handicap? I mean, do you deal with that in your research, in your philosophizing, in your in your work with people?
For sure. Yeah, certainly. One of the things I notice, in fact, amongst the students here at Loyola, they're really wonderful. They're really wonderful kids, but young men and women. They're not kids. They're young men and women. But I notice that they get nervous really fast. They get anxious really fast, and then they withdraw from that place of tension, from a potential conflict. And often they do so for good reasons. Like, they are very gentle with each other. They will go to great lengths to avoid offending one another. And there's so much that's good in them. I'm very grateful for them and appreciative of them. But often the way that they withdraw is into these small sites. They'll go listen to a song or put their headphones on. One of the things I do on campus here, for example, is I absolutely refuse to wear my AirPods around campus, outside of the building here, outside of the Jesuit community that I'm in right now, because I don't want to model for them that it's ever okay for me to not be available to them. And I always tell them, I have a kind of a funny story. I teach social theory to the undergraduate sociology majors. And so we had a wonderful class last fall, a year ago, wonderful young men and women. And we did a great essay, a difficult essay by the old sociologist George Simmel, and it's called The Metropolis and Mental Life. And this is written about 100 years ago, and he's already anticipating some of the problems that we're facing that we think are brand new. And I agree with you in some ways, John, like they are new for us, or they're ramified in some ways, magnified for us in some ways. But already 100 years ago, he's describing what the metropolis does to the mental life of human beings. And these students read this, and we had this they could not stop talking. And they wanted to say one thing, another thing, another thing, another thing. And that gave me a lot of great hope, both gratitude for them and appreciation of their intelligence and their rigor of reading, but also great hope because they were voicing their discontent with the way they are living. That's a great sign of hope. So I feel very proud of them to be able to do this. So in the middle of that conversation, I said, okay, now you guys, I'm going to tell you something difficult that you're not going to want to hear from me. And they're like, okay, Father Gilger, you're always saying that. Yeah. And then I say, you've read this article. The reason I'm saying this to you is because you've read this piece. Stop wearing your headphones around campus. And they were all quiet for a moment as the realization kind of hit them of what was happening and the way that they were filling their lives with this cacophony of noises and voices. And they were quiet for maybe 10 seconds, which is pretty long in a classroom. They were really sitting there. And then this one young woman at the back, she's wonderful, funny and smart and everything. And then she just threw up both of her hands. She goes, nope. So you can see so this is happening to them absolutely without question. So can I say one other theory thing that maybe help us get a grip on what's happening here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know I tend to go on a little too long. Sorry, John. So anyway, this is last thing is that so this is definitely happening, but it's been happening for some time. And these same kinds of challenges, the cacophony of voices inside of our heads, have been happening for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing new about this. Of course, there is. And having our smartphones in front of us is, as we know, like having a high school reunion, a football game, an entire casino, and, every song you've ever wanted to listen to at the best concerts of your life, all in one thing, all calling you, and your mother's there, like it's all together in this one place. And we love all of these things. So there's something different. But the thing that is the same about it can be, I think, clarified by a distinction made by the very strange, iconoclastic, Austrian-Hungarian priest Ivan Illich, who died, a few years back. And Ivan Illich made this distinction between tools and systems. And tools are everything from like a hammer to a phone to a book to all of those different kinds of things. And he said these tools may be not good for the human being, right? They may not fit us well, but tools we can master through discipline, right? Even if it's something dangerous, like, a rifle or something like this, we can master it and make it safe on our own. We can become the master of the tool. But once the tool gets transformed into a system that it is not possible for us to master, but it masters us, we no longer have the capacity to regulate it for our own good. So what's an example of a system? The US highway system, right there. Part of our reason that, Pope Francis has to be critical of the United States when in Laudate Deum is because we don't have another way, we individual human beings who are interested in listening to him, to get from one place to another. I love Pope Francis. I want to listen to what he said. I want to be obedient to him. I have a vow of obedience to him. I'm a Jesuit. But I also drove to Cincinnati and back this weekend. I don't know, right? I cannot master the system. And that's the kind of thing that's happening with the attention spans of young people today. They might be able to master their use of these AirPods, but they can't stop living in a world where all of their friends text them, and that's the social relationships there. Yeah. So what do we do? The only opportunity we have is to try to build up small communities that resist collectively these kinds of systems. We build up in another way that kind of an action. So this is a place where churches can become incredibly important, but not only churches, not only ecclesial movements, also, like the Girl Scouts, also going to the Elks Club, also Little League, places where we can move out of these systems and build relationships in other new ways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.